students. This example comes from a piece of research by people at the World Bank, and it compares the performance of children in high and low castes doing mazes. So they're given these little mazes, piece of paper, where they have to find their way into the center, and they see how many they can do in a given time. They do them under two conditions. One, where they don't know each other's caste. And when nobody knows, when they don't know each other's caste, they do equally well. The low caste kids do at least as well as the high caste kids. But as soon as they do know each other's castes, where they've had to say where they come from, which village they come from, what their father's occupation is, and so on, suddenly the low caste kids do much less well. And you may know of experiments that have been done with children in primary schools. There's a particularly famous early one called the Blue Eyes experiment in the United States, where again kids were made to feel that one bunch of them were better, the other worse than the other, and very quickly it affects performance. So I think that is part of this picture of why increasing social status differentials with more inequality gets to people and has so many effects on health and a range of social problems. But I think we need really to think of these processes working in two stages. There's the adult experience of how society seems, you know, whether people are more or less cooperative, whether they're fairly aggressive and competitive, whichever it is. And there's then transmitting this to children, because a lot of these effects seem to be emphasized, amplified by early childhood experiences. And if children are brought up very toughly, they become more aggressive and less cooperative, less empathetic, and so on. So I think one needs to regard parenting as almost a system for transmitting the parental experience of the nature of external society, of adversity or cooperation or whatever, transmitting it to the children. And it looks as if there are perhaps many, not just programming of stress responses, but perhaps other maybe epigenetic effects of the early environment, which prepares children either to deal with a society where it's important to be able to trust people, where you depend on reciprocity, on mutuality, your security depends on cooperation, or alternatively prepares them for a society where people are much more competitive, where you have to look after yourself, fend for yourself, learn not to trust others, perhaps to fight for what you can get. That needs quite a different emotional and cognitive development. And so think of it in two stages. There's the parental experience, and there's a transmission of that to the children to affect how they develop. I want to just say a few things about causality, because I found when you go through this sort of stuff, people still say, well, might the relationships all be the other way round? Might it be that society gets somehow nastier and then that leads to these other things and widens income differences? I think there's several things that mean that it's very unlikely to be the other way round. One is simply that I've shown you, well, Kate showed you about 10 different social problems, and they move to a substantial extent together. You know, we saw that it was the same countries that do badly and the same ones that do well. That suggests they've got common causes. And you can't really, if they've all got separate causes, nothing in common, then why should they move together? Why should they all be worse in the more unequal countries? Why isn't health good in an unequal country and something else very bad, rather than finding they divide up in the way they do? So I think that simply the fact that we are talking about a general social dysfunction does suggest that they have a common cause, and I'm suggesting the common cause is inequality. I think another reason for thinking that they are linked in the kind of way we suggested is we have been talking about the problems with the social gradient, the problems that are more common in the poorest areas of society. So they are the problems we know are related to class and status and hierarchy and all that sort of thing. And so we're not saying anything entirely new about them. We're just saying, okay, they are related to class and status. And if you make those status differences bigger, these problems get worse. They become more common. So we're not suggesting a quite different new causality. We're saying that the nature of the social gradient is the same as it's about relativities, it's about social position. Just two other reasons why I think that you can't argue that this all works the other way round. One is that, okay, supposing that income differences are allowed to widen because of a change in political or economic ideology. And I think that did happen in the 1980s when a number of countries' income differences widened and there was a, monetarist economic theory became predominant. And a number of countries also weakened trade unions' negotiating power. So you might argue that, okay, there was a change in ideology which led to a change in income differences. Okay, but the governments that did that, that allowed that to happen, never intended or never foresaw that they would also lead to more obesity, more violence, more teenage births. Those were the consequences, unintended consequences of the actions they took, allowing the income differences to widen. So you can have an ideology that changes income differences or leads to political change, but it then has all sorts of unintended consequences on the social life of the society and the kind of social problems and how kids do at school, even things like bullying and so on at school, which are part of this picture. The last point is simply that we've shown some of the causal pathways. Kate talked about the monkeys taking drugs. We know that stress is important in health and accounting for the health differences. A number of the outcomes, I mentioned violence and disrespect and so on. You can see the causal processes. In some areas, some other areas, it's possible to demonstrate the causal processes by looking at troops of monkeys. You can, for instance, separate out the effects of social status from material factors by making sure animals get exactly the same food. They live in the same compounds. You can even manipulate social status. And you see that some of the stress effects of that go with low social status in non-human primates, macaque monkeys and so on, are similar to what are found in human beings. So we do know some of the details of the causality, as well as these other arguments thinking that the processes can't go the other way around.